Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today it's finally time for part 2 of my Oscar Best Picture challenge. In this episode I'll be covering all the movies from 1950 to 1969 and ranking them on my tier list. Before we jump right into the tier list, I have a couple things I want to mention. First, please subscribe to the channel and drop a like, it goes a long way in helping me out. And second, these rankings are based on my personal opinion of the movie and how much I enjoyed the movie. So there's some of these movies that I know are really well made, but I just didn't personally enjoy them, so that's how they're going to reflect in my rankings. So without further ado, let's jump into the tier list. To kick off this episode, we have a great one, 1950's All About Eve. The film follows a young girl named Eve who's enamored by the theater and the lavish lifestyle that comes along with being famous. She befriends one of her all-time favorite actresses, Margot, and slowly weasels her way into her life and plants seeds and causes turmoil that may lead to the older actress's ultimate downfall. This is one of the best character study movies I've ever seen, and I was completely glued to the screen throughout this film's entire runtime. This film got 4 actresses nominated, which is a record that still holds to this day, 2 in lead and 2 in supporting. Anne Baxter and Bette Davis, who play Margot and Eve, were phenomenal in this movie, and they give 2 of the best performances we will see over this 20-year span of Best Picture winners. The overall character arc we see of these 2 characters is phenomenal, and the on-screen chemistry between the 2 actresses is just as great. There's planting seeds of doubt, they're best friends at some point, there's love, they turn on each other, there's arguments. You get the full range of emotions, and these 2 characters are fully developed, and I loved every single second of their character progression. The ending of this movie is also one of the best I've seen so far. The final shot is my favorite final shot of any Best Picture winner so far. It is completely mesmerizing, and it really brings the film full circle without giving us any extra exposition, and it really just speaks for itself. This is truly one of the best Picture winners so far, and you really need to check this out if you haven't had the chance to see it yet. I'm going to put All About Eve right next to The Best Years of Our Lives in the amazing category. 1951 brings us the second Best Picture winner in color, and the first of many musicals I'm going to be talking about in this episode, An American in Paris. The movie stars Gene Kelly, who's a struggling artist in Paris just trying to make a name for himself and sell his work on the streets. When an extremely wealthy lady stumbles upon him one day, she falls in love with his work and also falls in love with him. But unfortunately, he falls in love with a French girl who's dating one of his close friends. Chaos ensues as they all try to struggle and figure out what true love really is and who belongs with one another. Now, I absolutely love watching movies in black and white, but this film needed color to succeed. I just don't see how this movie would be as enjoyable in black and white because the colors are so vibrant, the Technicolor pops right off the screen, and there are so many massive sets and dance numbers and vibrant costumes that just add so much to this film. The highlight of the movie is at the end where there's a 20-minute long ballet scene with probably like 10 to 20 sets. It is one of the best choreographed dance sequences I've seen so far during this challenge, and I loved every single second of it. There's not a single word of dialogue spoken, but so many emotions are conveyed, and it truly is one of the greatest endings to a Best Picture winner so far. As we progress through this episode, you're going to find out I'm not the biggest musical fan, and a lot of these musical Best Picture numbers didn't work for me, but I really enjoyed most of the music in this movie. Gene Kelly is dancing and singing his butt off, and it's hard just not to enjoy his presence on the screen. I will admit I do like Singing in the Rain a whole lot more than this movie, but I truly do enjoy what he's doing here. Like many musicals, I do find the story to take kind of a backseat to all of the vibrant colors, dancing, and music that's taking place. I find this love triangle of sort is a bit underdeveloped. Gene Kelly basically wants to marry this French girl after spending 30 minutes with her, and I think that's just something that I've had a hard time, fully connecting with during this section of Best Picture winners because a lot of musicals act this way, so I found myself not being fully invested in the story, even though I think it's serviceable for what it needs to do because the highlight of the movie truly is the choreography, the dancing, and the music, and the awesome vibrant colors that we see on the screen. I think this is a very watchable film, and it's definitely one of the better musicals I saw during this challenge, and I'm going to put An American in Paris right next to It Happened One Night in the good category. 1952 brings us one of the more interesting Best Picture winners so far, The Greatest Show on Earth. The film follows a traveling circus and two trapeze artists who are battling one another for the center ring. There's also a side plot where there's a clown running from the police due to some suspect things he did in his past. Now, when I say this film is interesting, I guess I don't really mean that in a good way. It's that this film is a giant mashup of multiple things going on at once. We have the side plots of the clown and the trapeze artist, but then there's just a lot of live circus acts filmed in the middle of this film. The film is about 2.5 hours long, and I think about an hour of this movie is just circus acts being filmed. Now, a lot of these acts are actual circus performers, as the Ringling Brothers Circus were most of the actors in this movie. They brought all of their animals, they brought all of their performers, and they basically starred in the movie. Alongside all these actual circus performers, there's some like documentary style scenes throughout. The one I remember most vividly is them constructing the giant circus tent. They had thousands of extras who actually set up the big tent, set up the tent as there's voiceover explaining how the traveling circus works. So with all of that, this film kind of ends up being this like half documentary style and then half fictional story shoehorned in about fake circus performers that are just actors inserted in. I really don't know the goal of Cecil B. DeMille, the director of this film. I feel like the movie was almost trying to bring the circus to audiences who don't have the opportunity to go out and see it live in person. Because back then in the 50s, if you weren't able to see the circus live in person, there really was no way for you to experience the circus. So having all these actual circus performers just filmed performing their acts and put in a movie, it allows people to go out and see the circus without probably spending a lot of money to go see it, because I assume it probably was pretty expensive to see this back in the day. I have to say I was ultimately pretty bored. I mean, the circus acts are cool to watch for a little bit, but there's just way too many of them, and they would also cut away to very fake audience reactions, and it was very kind of cringy and painful to watch. I also think the side stories of the clown and the trapeze artist were just very boring, and I feel like they're almost taking a back seat to watching these real life circus acts performed. I don't know. This movie was a real hodgepodge. The ending has like a giant train crash sequence that makes absolutely no sense. No one's really worried about animals and humans who probably died from this massive train derailment, and you're just kind of worried about your three main characters you've been following throughout this entire thing. I don't know. This movie just really isn't for me. It's all over the place. I think it's kind of messy, and I'm going to put The Greatest Show on Earth at the top of the terrible category. 1953 reverts us back to black and white with From Here to Eternity. The film follows a private who gets stationed in Hawaii. When his sergeant finds out he used to be an amazing boxer, he asks them to join their boxing team. When the private refuses, they make his life a living hell. All while this is going on, the commanding officer is having an affair with the sergeant's wife, which just leads to more drama for this side plot. Now, the majority of this movie is basically army men flexing their egos, basically just toxic masculinity turned up to the nth degree, and that's all you really get for the majority of this runtime. There's some kind of romance subplots when the privates go out to the bar and kind of meet some ladies, but other than that, this movie is really just army men being rude to one another in Hawaii. This movie's most famous scene is a makeout scene on the beach between the commanding officer and the sergeant's wife, and I'll have to say that is the highlight of the movie for me too. That scene is just so memorable, and it looks fantastic with the, waves crashing over them as they're making out. It's just so, over the top and, just old Hollywood romanticism that I couldn't help but absolutely love it. The performances in this movie are also really good as well. I really can't knock it there. It's just ultimately I was never really fully pulled into the story. Spoiler warning ahead, but the ending of this movie is Pearl Harbor taking place as the bombs are being dropped. As the bombs are being dropped, the private we're following tries to get back to his base so he can join his team and fight alongside them in the war, but he ends up getting shot due to friendly fire, and then the movie just kind of abruptly ends. And I think it's an anti-war message, but it never like fully displays that. Like, you can say it's anti-war just because you feel so bad for this private. He got bullied for not wanting to box when he explicitly said that. He struggled throughout this entire time. There's more drama that takes place, and then he gets shot for no reason. But it's definitely not the most like anti-war message I've ever seen in my life either. So I don't know. This movie was definitely a mixed bag for me. I enjoyed some elements of it, and then some of it really just didn't work for me that much. But I am going to place From Here to Eternity in the decent section. Up next is a movie many people consider to be a classic, On the Waterfront. The movie follows a man who witnesses the death of another man that is committed by his union boss's two thugs. When he ultimately feels responsible for the man's death, he meets up with the sister of the dead man and the local father to try to take down the corrupt union. The highlight of this movie is the performances. Marlon Brando is fantastic in the lead role, but my personal favorite performance in this film is Karl Malden. Malden plays the father, and he has one of the best monologues of any Best Picture winner at the bottom of a ship after an additional death takes place. It truly captivated me, and I feel like he is the most well-spoken actor that I've seen in any film so far. I am ultimately a little bit mixed on the story. I feel like it's mostly elevated by the outstanding performances, because the film just has those typical mob story beats where the underdog is just slowly chipping away at them and then ultimately takes them down. The ending of this film has a really nice courtroom sequence that I really enjoyed, and the ending of the film is really powerful as we watch Marlon Brando's character kind of walk into the docks to go back to work after the Union is defeated. I overall think this movie is really, really good. It just doesn't have that wow factor to me. I guess the performances are the closest thing to that, but nothing else really just blew me away with this movie. It's still really, really solid, and it's definitely a film that I think most people should check out, and I'm going to put On the Waterfront at the back of the good category. Next is 1955's Best Picture winner, Marty. The movie follows Marty, a lonely man in his 30s who still lives with his mom and is constantly being ragged on for being single. When he goes out to the bars one night, he finds a nice young woman that he ultimately ends up falling in love with, and he really wants to spend the rest of his life with her. This is the lowest budget for any Best Picture winner in history, and you can clearly tell that. This movie is very much dialogue based, and the script does most of the heavy lifting, along with the great performances from the two main leads. The film also clocks in just shy of 90 minutes long, making it the shortest Best Picture winner of all time as well. And honestly, with some of these Best Picture winners, especially ones I'm about to talk about later in this video, they just feel long for the sake of being long. I feel like sometimes you can get a really solid story out in 90 minutes, and this film did not waste a single second of screen time, and I don't feel like padding on and adding an additional scene would have added anything additional either. This film knew what it was, and for that I really commend it. I also think the movie has this really nice message about societal pressures of having to do certain things by a certain age. Marty is completely fine with working at the butcher shop and just living with his mom and just kind of waiting for things to unfold. It's not that he doesn't want to meet someone and get married, he really is trying, but sometimes, things just don't work out. And I think there's other elements of the story that play into that as well, regarding, like selling your house, and there's another couple that's married that's going through some difficulties. And I think this movie is really just trying to tell the audience sometimes it's okay to move at your own pace and just let life unfold when it needs to. While this movie may not have the massive budget, big flashy sets, or anything of that, it's just a really good, tight screenplay packed into 90 minutes with some fantastic performances, and I think it has a story that many people can connect with. And for that alone, this is a movie I can see myself revisiting multiple times in the future, and I am going to put Marty in the great category. From the lowest budgeted ever Best Picture winner that clocked in at 89 minutes long, next is a 3-hour long film that was filmed in 10 plus countries and had over 70,000 extras around the world in 80 days. The movie follows an extremely rich man who gets bet that he cannot travel around the world in 80 days. Once he's bet, he is determined to complete the challenge, so he takes his servant and they set off on an epic adventure. Now, for a film that is as massive as I just described, it does not have enough substance to justify its 3-hour long runtime. The blueprint of this movie is travel to a new country, interact with the locals, do some things that are very generic and stereotypical of people of that culture, kind of get stranded there, use extreme wealth to find a new travel method, and then go to the next country and repeat for 3 hours. Similar to my thoughts on The Greatest Show on Earth, I kind of found this to be a movie where people could see other countries and experience other cultures. At the time, I don't know how many, documentaries or different films were being made, kind of introducing people to other countries, ways of life. I feel like this movie was kind of a way just to give you a very high level and sometimes very stereotypical overview of other people's way of lives, so I could see people back in the 50s being interested by that element of the film. I just found the storytelling to be so basic and just kind of so boring that none of this ever really pulled me in. All the scenes just dragged on for way too long, and honestly, it was just something that never really clicked with me. Even the US section of the movie is just them riding on a train and fighting Indians, like trying to take them down as they're trying to attack the train. I just found it very just like weird, and I just don't get the overall point of the movie, I guess. I did kind of like the ending, and kind of for a comedical reason, for how long and drawn out this movie is. The ending is him completing the challenge in 80 days, and then someone walks in the room and it just abruptly ends. This movie ends like at a snap of the fingers for absolutely no reason, and I found that kind of comical, that you have this long drawn out journey and it's just cut short just like that and the movie's over. But this is a movie I never want to revisit again, and I am going to put it at the top of the terrible category. Next is the first of 2 David Lean films I will be talking about, The Bridge on the River Kwai. The film follows English prisoners of war who are forced to build a bridge for their Japanese captors. When the English colonel takes pride in the bridge that he built, he feels uneasy when he sees there's a plan to blow it up. Now, this is a movie that is epic in scale that I can get behind. They actually constructed the bridge on location to be blown up at the end of this film, and that is just crazy to think about. You can absolutely tell this film was shot on location too. It is just hot and sticky, and all the soldiers are dripping with sweat, and you can just feel how real it is. You can tell this is not done, like fakely on a set. You can feel the grandness of the jungle that they are trapped in. You can see the grandness of this bridge, and you can just easily tell that it is a physical set. It's so nice to see massive scale things like this when we're getting so used to CGI with modern movies. I was just completely mind blown by how massive everything felt in this movie. I think the first 2 hours or so of this movie is truly fantastic when the two leads of the army, the Japanese side and the English side, are butting heads about building this bridge. I think that was all perfect, and that's almost a 10 out of 10 for me. Where this movie kind of fell apart for me is after the intermission, where an American soldier goes and retrieves help, and they kind of set up the plan to blow up the bridge. I felt like that got very messy, and it got really drug out up until the final scene. I really love how the ending of this movie has a message where it's your ego can kind of outweigh your morals from time to time. And I feel like this movie has a much stronger anti-war message than From Here to Eternity did. I think the ending of this movie truly shows how you can kind of go on a power trip. you can just only think about yourself, but it also really displays just how stupid and pointless war can be sometimes, because ultimately at the end of this film, nothing really matters once the conclusion happens. It's a movie that really pulled me in. It's definitely a longer one, but it's definitely not the longest as we're about to see. But I really had a fantastic time with this movie. This is definitely one everyone should check out. It's definitely one of my favorite war-based movies I've seen in quite some time, and I'm going to put The Bridge on the River Kwai in the great category. Up next is the highly controversial movie Gigi. The film follows Gigi, a young girl living with her grandma, just trying to live her best life. When a longtime family friend falls in love with Gigi, he tries to invite her to live the rich, posh lifestyle that her aunt wants her to live. Now, when I say this movie is controversial, it's mostly because the film opens up with a song called Thank Heaven for Little Girls, sung by a really old man who rolls his eyes to the back of his head when looking at a group of young teenagers. The movie also has this really kind of uneasy feel throughout the majority of the runtime as well. Most of that is due to Gigi being a young girl. No age is ever given, but it really feels like she's probably in the 15 to 18 range, and the family friend that confesses his love to her is in his around early 30s, I would assume. And he says that he's been friends with the family for multiple years, so that means he's known Gigi since she was a very little girl, and she may not even be 18 yet, because we really don't know. So the movie has this very, very weird kind of like predatory vibes to it. Outside of that aspect that's kind of hard to overlook, I will say the costumes look fantastic. The sets are amazing. The main apartment room is like this very, very vibrant red that the Technicolor just absolutely lights up. I also think some of the songs are pretty good as well. This is definitely a movie that I never really want to revisit, though. It made me pretty uncomfortable. I will say, though, it's less than 2 hours long, so it's easier to sit through than some of these 3 hour long kind of mess of a movies I've already talked about this episode, so I am going to put Gigi at the top of the terrible category. Up next is the 1959 epic Ben-Hur. The movie follows Judah Ben-Hur, a Jew from Judea who must battle the Roman Empire to ensure his family can stick together after an encounter with Jesus. Now, this movie is almost 4 hours long, and this film is massive in scale. The sets were such a spectacle that there were bus tours showing people what the sets were looking like during construction while filming was going on. It was such a massive event that so many people were enamored by. The scene that this movie is known for is the chariot race sequence that is truly one of the most outstanding action set pieces in film history. It took over 5 weeks to film the chariot race, and over 100 horses died during filming. Beyond that, there is a boat battle sequence where one of these massive ships gets hit and water begins pouring in, and Judah has to help one of his captors escape. And I don't even know how they begun filming something that is that big and it looks so realistic on open waters. Beyond that, when Judah has to go back and talk to the leader of the Roman Empire, he has to walk up hundreds of steps to get to that man's throne, and that scene is also just mind-boggling from a production design standpoint. From a story standpoint, this film does drag in quite a few parts for me personally. A lot of the film does center around the story of Jesus, and I'm personally not the most religious person, so it was hard for me to connect with elements of that story. But from a filmmaking aspect, this is a 10 out of 10, but the story doesn't fully click with me. But if you are a fan of movies, this is a film you just have to see at some point in your life, just because the set design is so mind-boggling, beautiful, massive. And I just cannot believe that this film was made. I think part of that is just because something like this would never be made today. Film studios are not forking over the amount of money it would take to build massive practical sets like this. And obviously, like the things like animal abuse, that would be a no-go today, and it shouldn't be. But it's just insane to think that we will never probably see a film on this scale again, just with the advancements of CGI and movie studios not willing to pull off something like this. But for me, I absolutely loved this movie from a spectacle standpoint. Story, not so much, but I am going to put BenHur towards the top of the good category. Kicking off the 1960s is Billy Wilder's The Apartment. The film follows a man who lets his bosses use his apartment to cheat on their wives. When one night goes horribly wrong, he starts to question what he is doing as he starts to fall in love with someone he's very close to. Before I go any further, I am going to place this film on the tier list, and The Apartment is going all the way up next to Casablanca in the masterpiece category. This movie is phenomenal. If you haven't caught on by now, I really enjoy movies that have fantastic screenplays and are probably a little bit more subdued and not like these massive scale epics. As you can see here, my top 4 movies are very much heavily dialogue and performance driven, and we have another Billy Wilder film right down here in the great category. Billy Wilder is quickly becoming one of my favorite filmmakers from this era, as I've seen now The Apartment, The Lost Weekend, and Double Indemnity, and I'm very excited to check out more of his work in the future, as everything I've seen so far is absolutely fantastic. Shifting back to The Apartment, Jack Lemmon and Shirley MacLaine in the 2 lead roles are absolutely phenomenal, and they live up to the height of this fantastic script that was crafted. Billy Wilder's direction is also phenomenal. If you've seen this movie, there is a shot with a broken mirror in a makeup pouch that I just absolutely love, and it has been stuck in my mind since I've seen this film. The quick, snappy dialogue is also such a treat, and this movie also has so many twists and turns, and the ending is absolutely phenomenal. I don't even want to spoil it in this movie, because if you have not had the opportunity to see this film, please, as soon as this video is over, go check out this movie. Go in as blind as possible. Do not look up anything, as even some of the synopsis on IMDb and Letterboxd give away a little bit too much of the story in my opinion, but this is a true treat, and this is one of the best screenplays I've ever had the chance to see on the big screen in my entire life. I love The Apartment. Up next is the beloved musical Westside Story. The movie follows 2 rival gangs in New York, the Sharks and the Jets. When a member of each side fall in love, tension boils over to rage, which leads to bloodshed. Now, I'm going to say I'm not the biggest fan of this movie. I think the movie really needs you to buy into the relationship of Tony and Maria, and I really just didn't get it. They shared one dance together, and it's really just love at first sight, and the fact that people are threatening each other's lives over them going out together just because they shared one dance just doesn't click with me. Beyond that, when you have the elements of kind of like upbeat singing and dancing, and then it'll abruptly stop into very serious dialogue about threatening someone else's life, I feel like those 2 elements just didn't mix well together for me, and I'm not the biggest fan of musicals, so that really didn't help at all either. With that being said, I do think the choreography and set design are really good in this movie, and I like about probably half of the songs that appear throughout the film. I think the true standout in this movie for me, though, is Rita Moreno. I do think Rita's performance of Anita is the best character in the film, and her rooftop musical number slash dance sequence is the best part of this movie. Especially when compared to other people in this movie, I feel like their performances aren't that great, or I just kind of don't really enjoy the over-the-top musical nature that they're presented in. If Rita Moreno wasn't in this movie, I really don't think I would even enjoy it as much as I did. She really is the highlight of the entire film, and I completely understand why everyone fell in love with her, and she won the Oscar for that role. Ultimately, for me though, this is just a movie I didn't personally enjoy that much. It's a movie that I don't think I'll revisit anytime soon. This was actually my second time seeing this movie, and it really just didn't even click with me on the second viewing either, so I am going to put West Side Story at the top of the average category. Next is David Lean's second Best Picture winner, the 4-hour-long epic Lawrence of Arabia. The movie follows British officer T.E. Lawrence and his goal to assist Arab tribes against the Ottoman Empire during World War I. Now, this movie is massive in scale. It is by far the largest Best Picture winner I've seen so far, and that's due to the fact that the majority of this movie is shot on location in like massive, massive deserts in Jordan, in Syria, in other countries of that nature. I think some of my favorite shots personally are when they are wide shots of the desert and everyone is riding camelback. It is just amazing to see miles and miles of sand and dunes against the sky, and you just see little specks of people riding camels. It's unlike anything I've ever seen before, and it truly is a magnificent looking movie. I really enjoyed the movie in the beginning too, kind of seeing Lawrence go out and kind of integrate with these tribes and earn their trust as they slowly kind of like start to pick up pace and win a few battles is truly a really fun part of the movie. But as the film rolls along, that 4 hour long runtime really started to drag, and I felt this movie just kind of like go on and on and on. I also think everything that takes place after the intermission is also a little bit messy. T.E. Lawrence kind of goes on like a power trip and he doesn't fully know what he's doing, but he kind of like wavers back and forth and you never really know what his true intentions are, and it kind of just fell apart for me at that point. I think also that's kind of when the wow factor started to wear off. You could only see so many massive shots of the desert and like wide escaping landscapes, and it just kind of loses that wow factor after, you know, like the 3 hour mark. I really understand why a lot of people absolutely adore this movie, and I do think it's one of the best looking movies ever made, but some of the story elements just weren't there for me, and that runtime really started to drag on by the end. I'm going to put Lawrence of Arabia at the back end of the good category. 1963 really tested my patience with Tom Jones. I'm just going to put this one where I place it right now, and this film is all the way down here in the terrible category. Fuck this movie. It is boring. It is annoying as shit. I cannot stand this movie, honestly. It was just a awful experience. It was a pain to sit through. The movie follows an orphan Tom Jones who's a womanizer in 18th century England, and he has to kind of like go out on his own on an adventure after the woman he kind of likes sees him cheating on her with another girl. I think this movie is supposed to be a comedy. I don't know. I didn't laugh a single time throughout the entire fucking film. I just could not stand it. It was an absolute drag, and it was just painful. Paired with the god-awful script, there's just so much shaky camera work and awful editing. I really don't understand how anyone watched this movie and enjoyed it. There's a scene where they're kind of chasing an animal through the woods, and it literally feels like if you just grabbed your phone and just violently shook it up and down while sprinting through the woods. I don't really get what this movie was going for. I don't know why anyone liked it. I didn't take a single thing away from this movie that I enjoyed. It is just truly a awful experience. This movie could easily rank at the last spot for me, but I just have a hard time doing that because the Broadway melody just seems so incompetent with its use of audio, and Cimarron was just kind of boring and extremely racist. So I feel like those two movies are just on another level of terrible. Tom Jones at least is like competently put together. Like you can tell there's like a through storyline, but oh my god, it was one of the biggest drags I've ever had to sit through. And you know, even something like The Greatest Show on Earth and Around the World in 80 Days or Gigi, they kind of have like a spectacle aspect to them. They're massive. They have a lot of extras. There's a lot of things going on. There's some cool camera work. Where Tom Jones is clearly a lower budget film, and it just has nothing going for it. This is a skip. If I've ever seen a skip, do not watch this film. It is not worth your time. Up next is another musical with My Fair Lady. The movie follows a poor flower girl played by Audrey Hepburn who gets brought in by a professor who wants to turn her into a rich, posh lady that can live the lavish lifestyle of the rich. I think one thing this movie really has going for it is there's a lot of films that I've talked about so far where I feel like the ending has fallen apart, which made me lose it a little bit. I think My Fair Lady is the weakest in the beginning and only gets better as it goes along. Audrey Hepburn has this really kind of over the top annoying voice at the beginning, and I really thought I was going to despise this movie, but she kind of drops it as the film goes along and the story progresses. Another thing this movie has going for it is costumes. This movie has the best costumes I have ever seen in any film. I just loved looking at all the crazy like hats and dresses that were made for this movie, and the big party rich lifestyle scenes were just so beautiful to look at, as there were so many flowing dresses and amazing suits and outfits to look at. I also really enjoyed a lot of the music. I think a lot of the music in this film is not really standalone, as a lot of dialogue and plot is driven through the lyrics, and I kind of enjoyed that a little bit more. A lot of time a song just kind of like has one solid like emotion or story element it's trying to get through, where there's a lot of story progression through these songs, and I think they're really fun to listen to. I also like how the movie was kind of over the top in nature. It almost seemed kind of like a satirical take on this rich lifestyle. I mean, part of it is kind of like true about how they think they're better than everyone and how they think they're above everyone. But I mean, there's a lot of good jokes and comedy elements sprinkled throughout that kept me thoroughly entertained as well. For a musical, I really think My Fair Lady is one of the better Best Picture winners. I had a really good time with this movie. I really enjoyed looking at it visually, and I'm going to put My Fair Lady in the good category. Up next is probably the most famous musical of all time, The Sound of Music. The movie follows a young woman who becomes a governess in a household of 7 children with an ultra-strict father. When he doesn't really allow them to do anything, she tries to introduce the love of music and arts to them. This is probably the only musical out of the bunch where I can say the music really carries the film. There are some all-time classics that are cemented into pop culture, like Do Re Mi, 16 Going on 17, and My Favorite Things. I also think the locations are absolutely beautiful. Of course, there's the massive shots of Julie Andrews dancing through the fields with the massive mountain backgrounds, but I also feel like a lot of the homes are really intricately put together and look absolutely fantastic. I was kind of shocked at how bare bones the story was. I feel like this is just a very run-of-the-mill romance storyline, and I really don't think it's that interesting of a movie, to be honest. I think when it comes to this movie, I would rather just listen to the soundtrack on its own than have to sit through the movie to hear the music. I just feel like a lot of the scenes don't really amount to much, and everything is just kind of very slowly paced and put together. I do, however, think the movie has a really solid ending where the father is pushing back against the Nazi power and the family tries to escape to a country where they can have their freedom back. Overall, though, this may be an all-time classic for many people, but for me, a lot of the story elements just didn't work. I will say, though, the music is phenomenal, and that gets a 10 out of 10 on its own, but paired with the movie and kind of the shallow, bare-bones story that really didn't do much for me at all, I am going to put The Sound of Music at the back end of the decent category. After multiple years of massive epics and huge musicals, 1966 brings us a much smaller film, A Man for All Seasons. The movie follows the true story of Sir Thomas More and his conflict with King Henry VIII after he rejects the Roman Catholic Church when he wants to get a divorce and remarry. I honestly enjoyed this a lot more than I was expecting. If you told me I was going to watch a period piece set in the 1500s, I probably would have told you there is a very, very low probability of me liking it, but there is a lot to like with this film. I think the bright part of this movie is Paul Scofield's performance of Sir Thomas More. His stubbornness and inability to connect with King Henry VIII is honestly one of the most fun aspects of the movie, and I really like their banter going back and forth. I also think this script is probably the driest of any in this video so far. It's very, very dense. The dialogue can be kind of hard to follow at some time, and it's very rooted in the time period that it's taking place in. With that being said, I think King Henry VIII is a fun character, and he sprinkles out some comedic elements throughout that really make the movie a little bit lighter, as Sir Thomas More is a very serious person. This movie does end up leading to a courtroom scene at the end, and it was a fantastic scene. I absolutely love courtroom scenes, but this one really drove the point of the film home, and it kind of took a twist that I wasn't expecting. I mean, if you know the true story behind this conflict, it's probably not that shocking, but I knew absolutely nothing about it, so I was kind of surprised by where this film ended up going. Overall, A Man for All Seasons is a movie I really did not think I was going to enjoy, but it's a film I definitely want to revisit. I think it has some really great writing, some really fun characters, and overall is just a really good dialogue-driven movie. It's not the best by any means, as it does have some slow spots, and I got a little bit lost at some of, the dialogue, just due to how dense and, kind of their old time English that was used throughout. But for now, I am going to put A Man for All Seasons at the top of the decent category. 1967 brings us our first cop drama Best Picture winner, In the Heat of the Night. The film follows a black police officer who's wrongly arrested for murder when visiting his mother in the Deep South. When he calls his boss, he offers him up to the local police department to help solve the case. This movie is absolutely carried by Rod Steiger and Sidney Poitier in the two lead roles. They are phenomenal and have fantastic on-screen chemistry together. This is also the first Best Picture winner to fully take on racial issues in the United States, and I honestly think it did a really good job. This movie also features a scene where Sidney Poitier's character strikes a white plantation owner. This is the first scene ever in Hollywood where a black man hits a white man, and it left people shocked at screenings when it came out. I think Rod Steiger is the true standout of this film, as it's really fun to see him kind of come around to really enjoying Sidney Poitier's presence and really standing up for him as a person. Ultimately, it doesn't ever fully come out with any explicit message against racism, but there's a lot of small seeds planted, and you can see the character grow throughout the entire runtime, and I really enjoyed that. I do think the case they're trying to solve isn't all that interesting, and sometimes it's kind of hard to follow where the investigation is going, mostly just because the local police department is just a group of bumbling idiots. So I feel like the story doesn't flow that well, and you can kind of easily get lost and confused about what is going on. I do, however, think this is the Best Picture winner with the strongest social justice message to this point, and it really shines through. And it's kind of shocking to see that that came out in the 1960s, as I know there's a movie that will be coming up in the next few decades that doesn't even handle that as well as this, and it's trying to kind of tackle the same issues, but we'll get to that one in a later episode. But for now, I am going to put In the Heat of the Night in the good category. 1968 brings us another musical, and I think it's the last one for a while, thankfully, Oliver. The movie follows a young boy who's working in a sweatshop and escapes and joins a group of pickpocketing thieves to try to make a better life for himself. I have to say, this is the worst musical I had to sit through so far. A lot of the music is child vocals, and they were like nails on chalkboard to my ears. And apparently a lot of the music was just dubbed in after, so it's not even the child actors singing. The movie also has a lot of dance scenes that go on for way too long. I mean, they look okay, but they just don't compare to other musicals we've already seen, like The Sound of Music and My Fair Lady. So it's just really not that interesting to me. One interesting fact about this movie it was the first G-rated and is the only G-rated movie to ever win Best Picture. I think the movie does really have some Disney vibes to it. It almost could be a Disney movie if you told me it was and I just didn't see the opening credits. It wouldn't shock me at all if it was, but that doesn't help save this movie at all. I found a lot of the adult characters to be very one-dimensional and boring and over the top. And honestly, I just couldn't stand all the child acting and child singing. It was just very painful to sit through. I am going to put Oliver down in the terrible category. Thankfully, we will end this episode on a high note with the 1969 winner, Midnight Cowboy. The film follows a young man named Joe Buck from Texas who moves to New York City to try to become a male prostitute, as he thinks women there really want cowboys in their lives. When he arrives in New York City, though, he finds out that's not the case, and he ends up befriending a homeless man, and they live together in an abandoned apartment building, and they have dreams of escaping to Florida together. Well, Oliver was the first G-rated movie to ever win Best Picture. This is the only X-rated movie to ever win Best Picture. If you look up the movie now, though, you'll find out it has an R rating, as its X rating was dropped at some point in the past. The only reason the film had an X rating is that there are a lot of homosexual themes and scenes throughout, which ultimately doesn't feel justified when watching the movie. There really isn't a whole lot going on. There's a lot of things implied, but nothing is really shown, so I'm really glad that this movie did kind of get that X rating dropped to an R. The two leads in this movie are played by Jon Voight and Dustin Hoffman, and they give two of the best performances of this 20-year span. It's kind of interesting how this episode is bookended by two amazing performances from women in All About Eve, and now two male performances in Midnight Cowboy that are just absolutely fantastic and must-sees. This movie has a lot of exposition told through weird kind of flashbacks where you don't fully get what's going on. It kind of took me a while to get into the groove of this movie. You can really tell this film is ahead of its time, and I'm interested to see how its style leads into the Best Picture winners of the 1970s. The overall landscape of New York City is fantastic, and I love the look of their dingy apartment that they're squatting in. And it was just really easy to connect with these characters. They're both extremely flawed in their own rights, but you can tell that they just want a better life for themselves, and they just really want to be comfortable and live a happy life, but they're just kind of being dealt a bad hand, and there's nothing they can really do about it. This ending has a very, very strong emotional moment, and it absolutely hit me deep, and it's definitely one of the stronger endings of any Best Picture winner. This is a movie that I think everyone should check out. It is a really, really great film, and I am going to put Midnight Cowboy in the great category. And to end this video, I'm going to give my honorary Oscars for all the above-the-line categories. Kicking things off in the supporting actress category, I went with Rita Moreno in Westside Story. This may be a little bit of a shock, as I didn't care for that movie all that much, but she really was the strongest part of that movie, and I loved all of her song and dance sequences, along with her acting performance she gave as well. What I was honestly kind of surprised by is the lack of supporting actress roles in Best Picture winners in this 20-year span. Movies like Midnight Cowboy, In the Heat of the Night, Lawrence of Arabia, and Bridge on the River Kwai don't even have supporting actresses in them, and some of those don't even have actresses, period, that would be able to get nominated for a role. So there really was a true lack of movies in this batch, but I think by far in a way Rita gave the best performance. Moving over to the supporting actor category, I went with Karl Malden in On the Waterfront. I mostly went with him because his monologue scene in the shipyard after another death takes place is one of the best sequences in this 20-year span, in my opinion. He delivered that line dialogue perfectly, and he really was a super, super strong character in this movie. He's just the one that stuck with me, so that's why I went with him. Actress in a leading role was just a really another easy category for me to pick. I went with Bette Davis in All About Eve. Really, her only competition for me in this 20-year span is Anne Baxter, who was in the same movie as her. Both of them just gave two of the best performances over this 20-year span, so I absolutely knew I had to go with one of them. I just really liked Bette Davis's performance just a tad bit more. I think her character is just a little bit more developed, and I think I liked how she displayed her emotions a whole lot more, but both of them are phenomenal in All About Eve. Lead actor ended up being a three-man race for me, with Rod Steiger and Sidney Poitier in The Heat of the Night, and Jon Voight in Midnight Cowboy. I ended up going with Rod Steiger because I really liked how subdued his performance was, and I really liked that he didn't have some big, flashy end scene where he kind of lays out all his feelings and he talks about how he's a flawed human being. It's really just subdued, and you can kind of tell how much he progressed from the beginning to the end, but it was just in small increments. And also him just chomping on gum throughout this movie stuck in my mind. But I think Rod Steiger really deserved the lead actor Oscar at the year he actually won his Oscar, and I'm going to give him this award as well. I will bundle screenplay and best picture together, as I gave both of those to The Apartment. I think The Apartment is just the best package overall. Even though none of the performances wowed me enough to give them an award, it truly is the most watchable movie out of this 20-year span and the most enjoyable. I just loved how tense and emotional this movie was and all the twists and turns that it took. I think that Billy Wilder is probably one of the best directors for these types of movies that are very heavily dialogue driven, very snappy, just very fun. The Apartment is a movie that I'm going to revisit multiple times in the future, and it's very close to nudging out Casablanca for the top spot so far. And then finally, in the middle slot of the bottom row there, I gave Best Director to William Wyler. I was just absolutely blown away by the amount of practical sets that were used in this movie and how massive they were. After reading about how that famous racing took over 6 weeks to film, and all of the trials and tribulations they went through, and how they had bus tours coming through just touring the sets, I really had to go with this movie. I think David Lean was a very close second, especially since he had Lawrence of Arabia and Bridge on the River Kwai, which were both massive and huge in their own rights, but they utilized a lot more on-set locations, which is very, very awesome in its own right. But the fact that William Wyler was able to utilize practical sets to get this massive 4-hour-long epic out of it, I have to give him all the credit in the world, so that's why I went with him. Well, there you have it, my Oscar Best Picture rankings through 1969 and my honorary Oscars. The next episode will be 1970 through 1989, so make sure to subscribe so you can get notified when that video comes out. Also, feel free to leave a comment and let me know what you think about my rankings or your thoughts on some of these Best Picture winning films. I look forward to seeing you all in the next video. Have a good one, everybody.